This is a medical false flag for the attempted introduction of draconian, literally from an exopolitical point of view, rules, and the introduction of a massive new world order. And all of it is against the most cherished standards that have been long extant, starting with the Magna Carta, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Bill of Rights in the US Constitution, and all such other standards. And so I beg this Honorable International Tribunal for Natural Justice to so find. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Lambermont-Weber, much appreciated. Chief Justice Sir John, would you care to comment?
I can echo what Judge Weber has said, that it's happening in various countries, and it's particularly happening in Australia. In fact, there was an interview with one of the politicians, and they asked for comments from the public, which was shown on the screen, and the first comment was, "Your new pass laws make this a fascist country." So that was quickly removed, but that was the comment, because they have brought in pass laws now in Australia, so you need documentation to go from one part of the state to another part of the state. I appreciate the Vancouver people might be able to meet in a Zoom cafe on a Saturday, but that is prohibited in Australia now, that you can't have more than 2 people at any gathering, and the 2 people must be 6 feet apart from one another. So that's the new normal.
And Chief Justice, with the pandemic and the resultant state of emergency in Australia, what effect has it had on constitutional rights there?
Oh, goodness. Sacha, there are no rights. Americans find it very hard to appreciate this. Australia does not have a Bill of Rights. The United Kingdom has one. The Americans have one in their constitution, but there is no Bill of Rights in Australia. Now, the interesting thing is that I had a look at it from a constitutional point of view, because these edicts are coming firstly from the federal government, and then they're being echoed by the state governments. And looking at our constitution, and in fact, I have it here, I'll just read some, not all of it. It starts off as most constitutions do, whereas the people, relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal Commonwealth under the Crown of the United Kingdom. The important thing is, the Constitution says that the linking of the 6 states, which was 6 separate colonies on the Australian continent, linking them together in a federation is indissoluble. Well, my view is that the states have just dissolved the Constitution, because the Constitution provides free travel from one part of Australia to another, and all the states now have gone back to the status quo that they had in the 19th century, where each state was in effect a separate country. So now we have 6 smaller countries on the continent, and the federal government has basically voted itself out of office. The only thing that's keeping them in office are the police, who are heavily armed and patrol the streets and arrest people they think shouldn't be on the street. They also asked the Americans, who very kindly have sent over 2,500 soldiers to help the police. So we are living under martial law, and so far no one has been shot, apart from one fellow in Queensland who yelled at the police, and the police in self-defense pulled out their gun and shot him. He's the first martyr that's happened. But people are being charged, being arrested, and the penalties range from 6 months as a minimum and up to 10 years for breaching the social distance rules, which means two people can talk 6 feet apart. The third one who turns up gets arrested.
Right. Well, one imagines that when this is all over, those mandarins and officials who are vastly exceeding their remit or their mandate from the people are going to be facing some very serious ramifications and repercussions, as well they ought. I just need to quickly ask Dr. Sandra Rose Michael to please give her 2 or 3 minute overview of the status quo before I revert back.
Well, I think what one of the pieces that needs addressed with our chief and Africa is that this is rather related to what happened probably with the AIDS and the HIV vaccines before. There is a component that is, we'll call recombinant or spliced in. This is a bat coronavirus, but it's also it's recombinant. It does not occur in nature. So this was a lab-created virus, and the patents have been issued to Pirbright Institute, which is owned by Gates Foundation. So that, I think, is some of the background information for that piece.
Thank you, Commissioner Sandra. Curiously enough, Bill Gates appears to be being roasted in the most unholy way at the moment on social media, on his own social media profile. We understand that many thousands of posts have been removed in the last few hours alone. Dr. Joe, I'm going to refer this to you, please, and then I'd also like to refer to Dr. John Martin, and then we'll get back to Robert David Steele. Dr. Joe, please address the issue.
Yes, I need to address this Perbram patent because this was known pretty much early on when I got information about the decoding of the virus. You know, I worked in virology during the times of the first SARS epidemic. So it was very interesting that I got it by the local news on the 21st of January. And it was actually like the little brother of SARS, and it's a beta coronavirus. So it's not related to that Perbram Institute coronavirus because it's a gamma retrovirus. So it's really into virology right now and relations in family and genetics. But it's like the WHO refused to rename it to SARS-2. It was actually the virology societies that decided to name that virus SARS-CoV-2, but the WHO decided on saying coronavirus, and it's the whole big family. So you get the confusion with the human coronaviruses and the actual SARS-like virus that we have. And I would agree with Dr. Sandra Michael that it, for me, it looks like a lab-stemming virus because there was this gain of function studies going on, and actually the SARS virus got patented that was isolated from humans, supposedly. That's what was patented. But I actually also know about an independent journalist from Bulgaria who found out about a laboratory where, under this disguise of diplomacy and diplomatic papers, pathogens were traveling to, and there was research done, and it was actually on the same, where I did my doctor thesis on the same viruses, that they did clinical trials, and it was on therapy, and it was not on vaccines like in Africa, like the report of the chief. But it was without any responsibility by this by this pharma company, Gilead, who's now presenting the we took this antiviral, this new thing that I've heard not so many good stories about, but it's like in this whole pandemic discussion, for me, it is a real virus. I know about the 5G problem, and for me, it's also a big problem, but it's adding up to each other in my perspective. And I want to add that there are so many different layers, and also the exosome theory is really important for me, because it's true we can see these exosomes, but there are also many viruses that are kind of ignored, especially in the viruses, in the vaccines, because all our laboratory cells are contaminated with viruses that can cause human pathology. So it was a big scientific and political attack, and I have checked on the science, and I can tell about that. So I have this experience from Frontline, talking to people who are in fear of having COVID, or like we say, being positive SARS-2, because you don't have COVID if you're positively tested. That's a misjudgment. But some get worse, and I talk to them as well. So, but I also see these measurements that are taken, and I have a child, and she's not allowed to go on the playground and play with other kids, and that's really hard. So we need to really be careful. But from my perspective, I think it was necessary. But you know, in treating diseases, you always look, is there a cure? And if it's the terrain that needs to be cleaned and needs to be healthy, then it's necessary to address that. And if it's a germ that is affecting the immune system, it needs to be addressed as well. And if there's a short-term therapy, it's like, you know, a colleague of mine got infected with leprosy. People were put out of the towns because of leprosy. Now we have antibiotics, and it was a tough cure, but he worked after that. And you know, I'm not afraid of viruses. I operated people with viruses, multiple viruses, and so it's. But I think it's actually a weaponization of germs and the information campaigns that are going against 5G and the additional problem to the viral disease, the smog and the toxicity and all that. It's not non-unicausal, these problems. And that's, I think, why we see the different numbers also from my country. And just so you know, we do autopsy on the COVID patients. So there are different results, but none of them was without any precondition. But who knows who has preconditions? That's the different thing. I, for myself, think I pretty know much that I am vaccine injured. So I'm pretty comfortable with everybody not putting me into the panic side when I want to have distance, you know. That's the other side. The other side of feeling kind of secure, but I don't want to have that lasting any longer. And the measurements remind me of history, sad history of my country, that I had the feeling I have to speak up, because we are not in lockdown like many of you are. We have that social distancing advices, and in some areas we have curfews, but that's kind of just where the epicenter of an epidemic is, an outbreak.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joe. Dr. Martin, would you care to comment on this?
Yeah, I'd like to comment, and also I'd like to take a more positive view of how to approach this as well as other infections. The essential research that is now coming into enormous relevance. Years ago, we noted that there were viruses which could cause cell damage in cultures, could give illnesses in animals, and yet did not engage the immune system. So I now put immunity to one side, and what you were saying about more the terrain effect, the ability of cells to resist virus on the other side. What cells need to function is cellular energy. We realize that food metabolism provides calories and energy in that pathway, but the body uses a lot more energy than provided by food. We therefore described an alternative cellular energy pathway, another way in which the body can get energy. That energy is reflected in a dynamic or kinetic activity in the body's fluids. We see it in terms of its effects in water as a loosening of the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules, and the water will also let go of some of the electrolytes like chloride ions in the fluid, which can then be beneficial to the humans. So what we now know, the body has this alternative cellular energy pathway, which can provide protection against viruses. Identified at first because they could protect against these self-adapted viruses, but the same pathway can help eliminate herpes infections using activated water preparations, sometimes thought of as homeopathy. There are data, good published data, in eliminating HIV, herpes simplex, papillomavirus. So there is a clear pathway to protect individuals against infections using the energy that can be transferred to activated water. What we also realize now that that energy is obtained from the environment. And as you mentioned earlier, I refer to it as KELEA, K-E-L-E-A, kinetic energy limiting electrostatic attraction. The fundamental purpose of this energy is probably, and I say probably, that it is necessary when you have positive and negative electrical charges. They are attracted to each other. That attraction gets stronger and stronger the closer they get, and yet there's no fusion and there's no annihilation. There's a repelling force at the end. So we call it this energy that limits that electrostatic attraction. But in water, it loosens the water molecules, makes them a form of chemical. In fact, it is indeed what chemists have been struggling with, what is chemical energy. And as if one is talking to a basic chemist, ask the basic question, what is chemical energy? They will say it's the energy you can derive from that compound during combustion. If you heat it up, you'll get heat out. And they say, no, not that one. What is the energy when you have linked chemical reactions? A gives B product, and that releases some energy, allowing C to go to D product. There was never a good explanation of that. This KELEA concept ties in with that chemical energy. What makes it then relevant is that it can be put into water, or we now have a nice location in Southern California where from a deep well, the water coming out of the ground is naturally activated. That energy in the water is transmissible to nearby water. You can either add regular water to it and it will become activated, or you can place it nearby to other water, and that regular water then becomes activated. The science is even more interesting. You can use that water to activate gasoline just by having it in close proximity and getting better gas mileage. But this has allowed the placement of that water into what we're calling water-ceutical pouches. And they're being sent to various individuals, not yet in a rigorous clinical trial, but what's encouraging is horse trainers are finding the same benefits of those water-ceutical pouches when they're treating horses post-exercise and illness. So the message that I wanted to convey through this group and other groups is to not simply look at the coronavirus outbreak in terms of flattening the curve, which is where the theme is at the moment, and make it slower, but still the same number of people under either the steep curve or the flattened curve. Rather, make people more resilient to infections using this concept of an alternative cellular energy pathway. People can activate their own energy pathway through the processes in the brain, or if they need it, in terms of water, and to move beyond this coronavirus pandemic to realize that as a result of vaccines, there has been a pandemic of stealth-adapted viruses that have impacted humanity in a very big way, but also into animals. And if there's one other concept relevant to this group, the idea of Cellular being a natural force bound by separated electrical charges allows for it to be entering the Earth in conjunction with cosmic rays. So we have protons, electrons coming into the Earth atmosphere continually with cosmic rays. We've got data and experiments showing that electromagnetic radiation, which also creates separated charges, can capture some of that Cellular coming into the Earth. I don't think it's only 5G. I think the enormous million-fold increase in electromagnetic radiation in the upper atmosphere has resulted in less of this Cellular coming to the Earth, that all life forms, not only humans, animals, and plants, get energy beyond food metabolism from this Cellular as an alternative cellular energy pathway, and that the electromagnetic radiation, by diminishing the availability of Cellular to life forms, has had an impact. So what we're, yes, I'll leave it at that. At some stage, though, I'd like to give a small comment about stealth-adapted viruses, because having those on board probably is impeding people's defense mechanisms, making them more susceptible to coronaviruses as well as other infections. Thank you.
To Joe, you put your hand up. Did you want to speak to something there very, very briefly?
Okay, I wanted to add that I'm very familiar with what John Martin said. I'm actually trained in something that is a history of 40 years with all these electromagnetic frequency interferences with the human body immune system. And the work of, for instance, Cyril Smith on that is really impressive, on electromagnetic sensitivity. For instance, it was in the 80s, so it's like a long-standing scientific body. And in the latest times, Professor Montagnier, who actually got the Nobel Prize for discovery of HIV, in contrast to Gallo, there was kind of a little fight who sequenced this HIV first, but he's actually doing research right now on this water memory issue, and it's explaining that with quantum theory and all that. So I have dig deeply into that, and what's concerning me with the 5G issue is that actually Montagnier has shown with German groups that you can induce a viral sequence into a tissue culture just by electromagnetic induction. So it's like, this is the paper for it on it. I don't know if you can see it. This is one of his papers on the transduction of DNA, and they did kind of the same with a genome sequence where they digitalized it, send it via mail, and then got the resonance frequency set into a PCR machine, and then could reproduce the genome, like sending a genome via mail. So it's like there's so much truth beneath what we think is known. So I think it's really, it has to be an effort of multiple different disciplines to take all these concerns serious, because for sure, if the oxygen is affected and you get a typical pneumonia, which this one is, where you get a swelling from in the tissues, then the exchange of oxygen is impaired as well, and it would add up to each other. Like, but thank you so much, and I really appreciate that, looking into these different things. But I think these viruses could also be these problematic viruses that contaminate the vaccines since the 1930s, when they started to do the research on it. So it's multiple generations of us, and they are shown it's retroviruses, so they can integrate into our DNA and we can pass it to our child. So that's where the susceptibility for the little ones rises if a mom that's heavily vaccinated is giving these viruses to their child, and then they're getting their first shots, and it's in their system that you get reactivation of these viruses that have integrated into the DNA.
Thank you, Dr. Joe. I'm going to have to move on. I'm sorry. Thomas J. Brown, as a trustee of the ITNJ, as a science researcher and a fellow of the New Earth University, please do give us a 3 or 4 minute overview of the status as you see it, and then please feel free to ask questions of our professionals. Thank you.
Oh, certainly, no, thank you. And I'm really appreciating what I'm hearing here. Get this out. One thing I would like to say as trustee of the ITNJ, right, that everybody speaking here is speaking of their own individual opinions, right? We aren't here as a collective group putting these ideas out. And I just want to make that clear because of, I think we're going to be getting more scrutiny from international press. So this is a discussion forum where everybody is here to give their professional and experiential knowledge and opinions on these ideas. So having said that, I'm going to take that hat off and speak as a fellow and science director at New Earth University. And in that, right, we've discussed here like the virus versus exosome theory. I just want to briefly touch on a couple things. I'll make it quick here. I was looking at one paper here, conserved and host-specific features of influenza virion architecture. Virions of many viruses are complex and pleomorphic, making them difficult to analyze in detail. And influenza virions therefore resemble exosomes, both in their hydrodynamic properties and in their protein composition. So we know there's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of science that is actually left out of modern science, going back to Béchamp and Enderlein, even in more modern times, Gaston Naissan's work with the somatids, these tiny bodies. And then, of course, the electrical side. I'm familiar with Luc Montagnier's work, was fortunate to meet him last year in Frankfurt at the International Water Conference. So we know that there's some unsettled science in this region. Now, the testing is very variable. There's a lot of people saying the testing is completely unreliable, but yet then I find a paper, Koch's postulates fulfilled for SARS virus that, so apparently that's been gone through. But then if I look at the, let's say the rapid regulatory status, here's from, for research use only, this is from makers of the test, SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus multiplex RT-qPCR kit. So this is from the instructions of the kit. The New York SARS-CoV-2 real-time PCR diagnostic panel has been designated to minimize the likelihood of false positive test results. However, in the event of false positive result, risk to patients could include the following, et cetera. They're basically admitting that these tests are unreliable. So this is a question, maybe Dr. Joe or John Martin can address at some point is, okay, it's a question of the proteins are similar. There's a real mix on this. We have people like Dr. Andy Kaufman, Tom Cohen's been out there saying, well, Rudolf Steiner said that, viruses are the excretion of cells. Now the anthroposophical doctors are up in arms because they're saying, well, Steiner never said that, and he didn't. But you have people quoting Steiner incorrectly, and there's this whole sort of mix-up in this field around there. So I'd love to, we really need to get more clarity. Moving on from there, we know infection rates are massively exaggerated. We got Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford. So I've got a list of these people. Professor Goetsch, official numbers wildly exaggerated. We're having a lot of top medical people saying this is wrong. We've got people like this Dr. Cameron Kyle Siddell, who is a emergency doctor in New York City, and he's saying that this stuff, it's defying common sense. The symptoms are not like regular pneumonia. It's more like people are taken from sea level to the top of Mount Everest instantly, and they're struggling for oxygen. And this may have something to do with electrodynamic action. Some people are attributing this to 5G, which, it could be from the area. We've got Senator Dr. Scott Jensen from Minnesota. He's a state senator and a doctor, and he's saying the CDC is intentionally telling them to defraud, basically commit fraud and put COVID-19 on the death certificates. And we've also have Montana physician, Dr. Ann Bukacek, who has been signing death certificates for 30 years, and she's a whistleblowing the same thing, saying, look, they're committing fraud on the numbers here. And so to the virus itself, right, there's a documentary going around now, the True Origins of the Wuhan Virus by Epoch Times, which is a Falun Gong group, which actually has come under a lot of fire in China, organ harvesting. We know about a lot of that. But we also know they've got connections to intelligence, Western intelligence. So in there, they're basically claiming that this whole thing has come out of Chinese weapons labs. And they're showing, the relationships. And actually, it's quite detailed and very interesting. They brush over briefly the connection of a Harvard professor, chemistry professor, who was arrested, who was Charles Lieber. So I started looking into him. And of course, now Gates is a member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He's been inducted in there. He has connections to the Wuhan lab. We know that Gates and Epstein were both involved in funding at Harvard. Epstein actually stating he was very interested in viruses. Lieber's research, curiously enough, is based on making virus-sized transistors for injection into the systems. So I think that there's a much bigger picture around all that. And we know with Fauci is tied in, so we can tie in Gates and Fauci to multi-generational eugenicist programs, which involve all these vaccinations around the world. And Chief Sylvestre, it actually hurts to hear what you're saying about what's happening there in Africa. I really appreciate your report. That's the first I had heard that, and I really hope you keep us informed on that. I think our best enforcement procedure we have right now is getting good information out to the public and keeping this as focused as we can on this. And basically then the global lockdown, which we know, the crackdown on human rights, if all this other material is happening with very, still unsettled science, questions on the testing, obviously people manipulating behind the scenes, what's really behind this lockdown? Yeah, that's my sort of overview. I'm sort of swimming in so much data. I'm a bit lost and daunted by it, and
thank you,
happy
Tom.
to be able to put some information in here.
Thank you, Tom, very much indeed. So please, Dr. Sandra Rose Michael.
Okay, of course, I do like to start also, not just the nutrition, it's all about the terrain. And that's where we need to start, the terrain. And our terrain, our bioterrains have been compromised. We're living in a toxic soup between the EMF, the ELF, the radiation, the electrosmog of that, and the controversy over 5G, which really should not be that much of a controversy as far as, one paper, September 13th, 2017, was 180 scientists from 35 countries recognizing, the symptoms of 5G, the hypersensitivity, but the Alzheimer's, cancer being related, and their concerns about flu-like symptoms. And this was a study from 2017, flu-like symptoms. So some of the symptoms of the radiation, which doctors are not trained to recognize or look at, the issues of radiation poisoning, and the 5G has specific frequencies with the 60 megahertz millimeter waves, which interferes with the oxygen uptake in the hemoglobin. And so that is part of what we're seeing with this, that with this virus is the body is not uptaking the oxygen. And so part of what she was talking about is standard of care when somebody goes in with the symptoms of COVID-19. It's SARS too. It's, you know, we've got a weaponized version where they took S proteins and to make that human-to-human transmission, and it's spliced. Anybody that's looked at the research knows that this was lab created. It was lab recombinant and created to be very virulent as far as to spread very easily. So there, you know, that gain of function studies that they actually did on this virus, and that's admitted. And it was released out of Wuhan, somewhere where there's that stage 4 lab. And I want to mention some of the background with that. The labs there is, that's very connected to the World Health Organization, which, you know, the connection with Gates, but evidently Soros was a major funder of that lab. And so this has been a long time agenda. And you can look at UN, you know, the UN agendas, depopulation agendas, the eugenicist, which there's a long history of that agenda being promulgated through Gates, etc. So there's those aspects. So when somebody presents at a doctor or a facility with SARS-like symptoms or this COVID flu symptoms, you know, there's the shortness of breath, which is part of it because of that oxygen uptake being interfered with. And I did read the studies of how this virus actually interferes with that oxygen uptake in the body. And it's very different than using ventilators. So the second reign is there's a lot of research now. I mean, a lot of research. 2 studies from France. The latest one from Dr. Raoul is over 1,000 patients. You have Dr. Zelenko in New York. It's close 900 patients the last I checked on his studies, having tremendous results with this combination of hydroxychloroquine, the azithromycin, and zinc. And hydroxychloroquine has been in use more than 70 years as an anti-malarial. Yes, the antiviral effects of hydroxychloroquine, but it's also a channel that gets the zinc into the cells. So again, we're back to nutrition. In a sense, this is a nutrient. Zinc in the cells stops the replication and the attachment of the virus into the cells. And so it's reducing the viral load very, very quickly. A doctor in California came out and said, even people with severe symptoms, when they're presenting, they're coming out and, you know, and being basically rather symptom-free in approximately 8 hours. Dr. Zelenko talked about people could breathe again from that shortness of breath in 3 to 4 hours with this combination protocol of hydroxychloroquine and the azithromycin with the zinc. And then they've also added vitamin C to that and vitamin D. Everybody knows that vitamin D is very, very important for preventing the flu. And this is something everybody should be doing. So I get very concerned when they want people to stay inside when they need the vitamin D, and just being outside will prevent most of it. And, you know, so for most people, the symptoms are very mild unless they've taken Advil. They're finding a real connection with the Advil and some of the other things. So it was like it was designed almost for it to affect people, because people will go pull an Advil or ibuprofen out of their medicine kit at the first sign of a headache, which is one of the first signs. And then that's part of the setup where those are the people having more severe incidents there. So that's one of the problems. I've also been on with Dr. Victor Marcial Vega, who is a signatory and part of that Shanghai official government recommendations for high dose vitamin C, both through orally and IVs. Dr. Victor Marcial Vega is very excited about is he was fast-tracked through NIH to actually get that study done. That happened this last week. In less than 24-hour approval. He has, of course, he's very highly credentialed, top 1% of credentials MDs, John Hopkins, trained oncologist, but he's been working with the high-dose vitamin C protocols for over 20 years. And so that is now an official study. And that's what was primarily used in China, is the high-dose vitamin C IVs and orally, which also is another thing that stops it. What's happening in the US is their standard protocol of somebody presenting not being able to breathe, and with the hypoxia, the oxygen levels falling, they've been trained to put people into these ventilators, and you had everybody demanding these ventilators. We need more ventilators. What they're actually finding now is 80% of the people being put on those ventilators are dying because they're being put into a coma, essentially, from the propanol and fentanyl to be able to intubate them. And they're dying alone without their family. And this is a total travesty. But they actually found that it's making it worse. It's because you wouldn't have that many dying on the ventilators. But it's very contraindicated with the way this particular virus. It's not the typical, it's very atypical in how that presents. But again, standard of care was intubation. And in the meantime, I know Paula found the research of how much money the companies producing ventilators has gone up. But ventilators should be a last resort. When you have something that, you know, what Dr. Zelenko found is in the first 3 to 4 hours of hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and the zinc, it's a $12 approximately cost. Can't be patented, and people can breathe in 3 to 4 hours. It's a 5-day protocol essentially, and 98% of people, this is highly effective, and this is what the studies are backing up. There's like 6 different studies internationally. You've got New York and California, so this should be one of the first things done. And then if that doesn't work, let's go to the high-dose vitamin C IVs and protocols like that. And then there are alternative cellular pathways, of course, as John Martin talked about, because we've got to have the energy for our bodies to heal. And that's part of, you know, the biophysics of it that we work with.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandra Markle. Have you finished there, Sandra?
Is there anything else you wanted me to address right now?
Well, we'll come back to it. What I'd like to do is to ask Thomas Brown, do you have any particular questions for the experts on this panel?
Probably a lot of them. Yeah, I'm very interested in the potential electrodynamic nature of the viruses, what's happening, and even just to find out, just what their position is on the terrain theory versus germ theory, right? Because as I was pointing out in my earlier discussion, the science is truly unsettled on this. So I'm agreeing with Robert Steele, on his counterintelligence sort of view of this, and Lieber being potentially the Lee Harvey Oswald of it. So as far as questions, I just really would like to know a bit more from our anonymous doctor what her position is on that terrain versus germ theory, and what she thinks actually really is happening behind the infections and potential spread of this. Because from what I've seen now, apparently there's supposedly from the test, if we can believe the test, and that's another part of the question, can we believe the test? They're doing postulate, but yet then the makers of the PCRs are saying that they're not, there's a lot of false positives. How do we really know? Can we be assured that there's any true science behind this? I think that's my main question.
Thank you. Dr. Joe, please, 2 minutes, no longer. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to address as well, because there are different tests out there. That's what I can speak to for sure, because on the 11th or 12th of January, the Chinese put out the sequence for this coronavirus in general, naming the family. And then there was a change, but it was really not really addressed by the WHO, although they changed the protocol to the German protocol, which I can speak to very well, because we get lectures like every day from the developer of the German testing of the SARS-CoV-2. And for that, that we are doing in our country, I can say that they are tested very rigorously to avoid cross-reaction with the human coronaviruses. I can't speak to the Chinese tests. I can't speak to the CDC testing, because like every country was free to do their own and do their own verification. And as it was done by the coronavirus reference lab, and I personally know this head of department. You know, he's really open and transparent with all he's gaining from it, and he's not into vaccines and all that. And he's actually kind of explaining the differences in antibodies that you need to have for getting immune. And that's what I wanted to answer to Paula, because they have found out from these first cohorts in Germany that actually there's a pretty rapid answer from the neutralizing antibodies. So you could expect after 10 days that these neutralizing antibodies, if it's a mild disease, get you rid of all the symptoms and you'll be fine again. And but sometimes people don't produce them, and that would be kind of after therapeutics, you could do that transfer of neutralizing antibodies as a cure as well. Nobody speaks about that. It's always the jump to vaccines. But for my personal protection, if I would be on the front line directly, I'm counseling on the telephone and I'm checking on going out of quarantine right now, but I would protect actually with the best mask I have and with goggles that are closing, because it's not excluded that it's aerosolizing, but it's actually really at the point where you take care of these people that are known infected and infected, but the infection goes down in the second week. So it's actually the first week where we are between 5 and 6 days. That's what's really consistent in. But that's kind of what I would address as well. I'm not wearing a mask when I'm going outside, because you know it's always about viral load, and I wear a mask when I'm going into the shopping mall, because I want to show that I take care of that someone else is not infected. But it's just a polite statement. That's what is told us.
Yeah, you were saying earlier that it's really connected to the viral load. If you're in a hospital or in an ICU unit, it's appropriate to wear a mask. But when governments reflex to these central commands and have people in jungles and in deserts wearing masks, it's a ludicrous. That's where it is a ludicrous pantomime. And it's also a multi-billion-dollar business and commercial industry, an entirely inappropriate one at that. Dr. Martin, is there any situation in which you would find yourself endorsing any kind of a vaccination program whatsoever to address the corona issue?
The data now are sufficiently compelling to stop all vaccines produced in animals for use in humans. The recent data indicating infectious cellular genetic sequences coming into humans from monkeys is essentially reversing some aspects of evolution. There's a risk in producing vaccines in animals of converting some of their cellular sequences into infectious components, and they're not good when they're introduced into humans. Not only that, some of these vaccine self-adapted viruses can act as a carrier of cellular genes, including mutated genes. This has the potential of converting many genetic illnesses into a transmissible infectious illness. These data have been published, but they haven't come into the public health debate yet. In my professional opinion, this is sufficient evidence to stop producing vaccines for use in humans, in animals, and in fact, addressing the issue why humans can now carry in their genome monkey sequences. We don't want that. And even monkey sequences have gone into other animals, such as chickens. And so as an unfortunate, unanticipated adverse effect of vaccines. Given the argument that we have beyond the immune system, this alternative cellular energy pathway, and I'll go back to that concept of terrain versus germ, it was very clearly defined as terrain by Beauchamp, being very generalized. What Pasteur did, and immunologists followed, was to narrowly define terrain as the immune system, immune defense. We go beyond that. There's more of a natural energy-based defense that the body has, which comprises, in my mind, a far more effective component of the terrain. What that also means is supporting that alternative cellular energy pathway is an acceptable alternative to vaccination because it doesn't carry the risk that vaccinations, at least the way they're produced using animal cells that can be contaminated with different viruses, using that the promoting the alternative cellular energy pathway does not have that risk. The very positive comment I made earlier is that that pathway can be added to using activated, energized, or what I call now accelerated water, but it also accounts for a lot of the positive psychology. In other words, as humans, we're bringing this Kalea energy into the body continually. Probably the brain is a primary receiver, and we have some conscious control over the efficiency of that receiver. So as I see feeling going forward, it's to emphasize the fact that we have an alternative cellular energy pathway different from the energy we obtain from food. This pathway has several unique features, including enhancing higher level brain functions, emotional intelligence, very effective at suppressing unnecessary inflammation in response to tissue damage, and that it can be conveyed using activated water when there's a deficiency, but ideally people can use their brain activity in a manner that will sustain this energy pathway and provide them the resistance to infections.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin. And of course, all that you're saying, which is absolutely brilliant, begs the question, why the devil does the World Health Organization, the Center for Disease Control, why are they not in possession of this science? Are there any pathways from an academic, a researcher, a medical scientist like yourself? Are there any pathways available to your expertise to get up into these hallowed halls? For the love of God, the commander-in-chief of the free world, of the United States, leader of the free world, probably doesn't have this knowledge base. Why do we have a World Health Organization at all? Why do we have an AMA at all? Why do we have an FDA at all? Why do we have any of these institutions when they're clearly failing to transmit the genius that's coming out of health professionals, medical science professionals like yourself? They are an absolute firewall between leadership getting the real science to the people. And that, to me, is the real issue here that we need to look at. Dr. Joe, I'll give you the floor for 1 minute, and then I've got to refer to Dr. Sandra Rose Michael before moving on to Judges Alfred and Seven. Carry on.
I just wanted to comment on that because it was actually the FDA with the Flexner report who expelled all the research on electrum and how the electricity and electromagnetic involvement of the body happens. It was in the early 20th century, and it was supposed to be from the electroshock that they banned it all. But from that on, we have that chemical, a big pharma way, and not looking into the electricity and electromagnetics. So it's really banned, and so it's really hard to get in there. I need to do it kind of under the freedom of treatment. But it's really endangered in Germany as well. So it's really necessary to address these issues, and energy in particular, like you address it, John Martin. I could kind of talk to you for hours, because I think we're using different names for the same thing. And that's so in so many disciplines is that way, that you could kind of just find the same language or adapt your own to talk about this high energy physics that's happening in your cells. And if that's impaired by a collective resonance frequency of a virus, for instance, you know, we need to understand this more. And it's like 100 years we're banned by the FDA to research.
Well, this is the point that we're getting to, and with this inquiry, what we've been doing with the International Tribunal for some years now is drilling down into the root here, the problem, these firewalls that exist between institutions and bodies that are mandated, and in fact, frankly, are committing treason when they allow genocidal agendas to prevail and prevent the good science, the good health and medical science from getting to the people and to the street. Dr. Sandra Rose Michael, do you believe that there is any rationale for having any kind of a vaccination program whatsoever under any circumstances?
I believe it's possible to produce safe vaccines. That's not what we have in any way, shape, or form being presented at this time. But the whole premise of it is really old and outdated science. Our real focus should be on how do we produce health? How do we create health? How do we stay healthy? Instead, it's a pharma cabal. It's everything has been big pharma, relegated to big pharma with the agendas, being aware as intelligence of the background agendas for population control, population reduction, but control through fear, through the media, the propaganda machine to keep people in fear, to be able to control. It's old Hegelian dialect stuff, problem, reaction, solution. And so they create the problem, blow it out of the water. It's totally a plandemic. It's created, and then make it that, they actually Gates came out and said there can be no mass gathering. We can't go back to anything normal until there's mass vaccination certificates.
Can I stop you there? Does Mr. Bill Gates have any kind of medical qualification whatsoever?
Not as his training for sure, but he's got a background of his father being a eugenicist. He ran Planned Parenthood. So you have, and that's a whole business in itself of what's done with the harvesting of the organs from the aborted fetuses and the glands and the discharges and all the child trafficking issues that's behind all that as well. But it's been a planned agenda for a long time for population control, for global control, new world order. There's many things, and we need to rise. We need to rise up as humankind and go, we're not going to take this anymore, and we have things, we have means to stop it, and that's what we need to demand.
Thank you, Commissioner Sandra Rose Michael. I just have a very quick question here to the Chief Justice, and I'd also invite Justices Alfred Lambermont-Weber and Justice Seven to also speak to this. Is there any place where civil disobedience is appropriate? Tearing down a 5G mast that is planted outside of your infant's bedroom window. For instance, the child has got blood coming out of its nose and is suffering from impossible headaches, and the child is sickening on a daily basis. You've tried to get hold of the local authority, the local municipal authority. You're not getting any substance out of them. They're not even answering the question whether this is 5G or not. You know it's a 5G tower. You suspect it is. Is there any reason why you should not tear that mast down if you cannot get satisfaction from your local government?
I would say you have a moral obligation to tear it down. The problem is that when you talk about legal obligation, the law really is divided into two parts. What we would call natural law, doing what is right and just, and the other is statutory law, where a decision is made by politicians and by judges that something is illegal, and if you do it, you go to prison. Now, I have a question of my own to the panel. I was looking at a short excerpt about Sweden, and they're not in lockdown. Their restaurants are open, the people are in the parks, and so on. What is so different about Sweden from the other countries that they haven't got into lockdown?
Well, there's an interesting fact to note alongside that question, Chief Justice, and that is that in Sweden, they're famous for not having enclosures. Houses abut other houses without having fences. So it's the most open place in the world in that sense, in terms of a first world developed nation. But that's interesting, isn't it? Does anyone wish to speak to that?
And so with that background and experience, I'd like to just read briefly our last of the 4 findings of law, and to commend and ask this tribunal, the ITNJ, to consider joining us in this call. Number 4, this tribunal calls upon all ethical attorneys at law and law firms, members of the bar worldwide, to collaborate cooperatively pro bono and in good faith to team up and bring investigation and legal court actions and prosecutions to promptly overturn and set aside, in the interest of justice and public health, any and all unlawful, unsubstantiated, and unjust Australian past systems. We're greatly influenced by the Chief Justice. Quarantine, lockdowns, mandatory vaccinations, and or martial law orders as based on the finding of facts above. Such pro bono attorneys and law firms and tribunals can request their courts to enter protective public orders, protecting the public from any further dangers arising from unjustified and unlawful quarantines, lockdowns, mandatory vaccination, and martial law orders, and from the public deployment of chemtrails, 5G, 60 gigahertz, and directed energy weapons deployments, i.e., these are all insults and dangers and weaponization against the public. And I would state that part of our mission here, fellow judges and witnesses, is for us to mobilize the legal system and the court system to shut this down, as we have shut things down, ranging from the outrageous prosecution of the Black Panthers in 1969 by the FBI and the deep state in New York, to many, many others.
In everything that they're doing, from the bills that are being passed, which are completely the replica of Nazi Germany, is being unfolded before our eyes. We're talking about people being brought out of their home, dragged out of their homes. They're going from door to door, taking healthy people out of their homes. We're saying children can be taken by them now. And all of the things that they're doing can be, in law, nullified. with laws like ultravirus. As much as they're creating these draconian lockdown procedures, we have laws that can overturn them. And that's my emphasis, and that has been the emphasis of our findings in terms of looking at this whole corona hoax situation. So that's where we're coming. We're coming from the position of, as much as they're creating laws to lock us down, we can reverse those laws. There are laws that cover this situation, and that's what we'd like to bring the panel's attention towards, reversing the laws that are locking down countries. Thank you, Sacha.
Thank you indeed, and that's so appropriate that you underscore there. Thank you. That's very, very meaningful and very timely wisdom. So, Chief Justice, I'm sure there's very little you'd be able to disagree with there, I'm quite certain. Would you like to comment at all?
No, I don't disagree with anything. I was listening to David Icke just recently, and he really summed it up in a nutshell in relation to the pandemic and the deaths. He said these people are not dying from coronavirus. They're dying with coronavirus. They're dying from something else. And I think that's very true, that every death is now treated as coming from the coronavirus. So we no longer have heart attacks. We no longer have cancer. We no longer have liver failure. Everything is coronavirus. And one of my colleagues in Sydney said just recently, they say that we've had 21 coronavirus deaths in Sydney. They haven't mentioned the 20 suicides that went with it from people who lost their businesses, lost their jobs, lost all hope, and they suicided. That wasn't even mentioned in the press. And I think it's fair to say that it's a hoax, but for some reason the governments are going along with it. That it's happening in other countries, but I observe it firsthand in Australia. They're getting ready to make these temporary rules permanent. One of the things that made me suspicious was 6 months ago, I discovered that the state police, Victoria Police, were being trained in riot control and were getting new weaponry. And that was 6 months ago. It was as though they were getting ready for something, because there is growing civil unrest with the performance of the government. And they've come forward with a financial package now to basically pay out of future taxation money to people to keep them quiet. And I'd just like to make a personal comment. Paula Woolley mentioned cod liver oil. It brought back memories for me, because I was brought up on cod liver oil because I'm English, and what you do in England with children is you give them cod liver oil. Tasted awful, but it made us very healthy.
Thank you very much, Sir John. Chief Justice, please, last word to you, sir, and if you'd kindly close this hearing, we'll call it a day. Thank you.
When I was listening to some of them, I remember from my childhood being told that you don't have to be as violent as the people you want to get rid of. I'm mindful of what Gandhi did. He wanted the English to leave India, so rather than fight them, he persuaded his fellow countrymen not to cooperate with them. And they eventually got the message. And that's one of the things we can do, that quietly let everybody we're in contact with know what the truth is, and tell them not to be afraid to pass it on to other people, because they're getting desperate when before they announced the news this evening, I mentioned the commentator had to talk about the burning of the 5G towers, and this was a conspiracy, a fake conspiracy that's been totally rebutted by the government. When they come out defending something that we haven't yet accused them of, it means they're worried. So I formally close this session and look forward to seeing, if not all of you, but some of you at future sessions. And I'd like to thank Sacha for his great role as a moderator, and Mark Pierce in the background, who's going to put it all together, and we'll have episode number 3 to show to the world sometime later this week or next week.